All right. So good morning, everyone. Thank you for your patience as we got, things a little set up and prepared for today's presentation. This is part of a series of talks that I'll be giving today on how to use your course evaluations tool. This is the first of two trainings. Now, to clarify, the training sessions are identical. So if you're attending this training session, there's no need for you to attend the other training session happening later this afternoon. Um, and Sorry, I got a little distracted by the chat function there. So while we have today's talk, again, feel free to ask questions. I'll be keeping my eye on the chat function. We're going to be going through some features today. Again, if you're looking at your own site and you're not seeing what I'm seeing, save those questions for later, since we won't be able to troubleshoot individual experiences during this session. But please feel free to pop in with a question or a comment in the chat function. I'll be keeping an eye on it. If I don't respond to it immediately, know that I will be paying attention to it. So to go ahead and get us started, who am I? So I'm Dr. Bethany Jacobs. I work for the education technology company Anthology. In the past, you may have known us as Campus Labs. We recently joined with two other ed tech companies to become a new company with the purpose of bringing together multiple software solutions for campuses like yours. What's my background? I got my PhD at the University of Oregon. I was a faculty member for 10 years at the University of Oregon and at the Georgia Institute of Technology. So I come to this experience as someone who's had a lot of course evaluations done in my career. I know the experience of reading through course evaluations. I know what the positive aspects of that experience and the negative aspects of that experience. And we're going to be talking today about how to use the course evaluations tool, but we're going to also be having some bigger level conversations about how to connect with your students and how to use the course evaluations tool to build a culture of assessment in your own classroom. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off my camera for now, just so that we can focus on the presentation that I've got for you folks. And as I said, I'll be keeping my eye on the chat function while we talk. So what are we going to talk about today? We'll talk about navigating through your site. For some of you, this is going to be familiar. For some of you, you're going to say, I've never logged into my site before. I don't even know how to log into my site. And we'll be talking about how to do that. We'll also be talking about filling out your objective selection form and the significance of that. Something we're not really going to be talking about today is delving into reading your faculty reports. Most of you are already familiar with the IDEA system. We'll talk about where those reports are, but we're not really going to delve into interpreting reports. And throughout all of this, we're going to sort of pepper the conversation with this recurring thought, which is how do we stay connected to our students in these particular times? If you were like me, if you are like me as a faculty member, I really relied for my teaching on being connected to my students, on seeing my students in the classroom. This year, things have changed, obviously. Many of us are either working in a hybrid environment or a purely online environment. We've had a lot of anxieties about teaching and learning in the midst of the COVID crisis. So there's a lot of questions of, has teaching suffered as a result of this? Am I able to teach as effectively? Are my students learning the way that I want them to learn? How do I stay connected with them in this time when I might not be actually seeing them and getting to know them in the way that I'm used to? So I really want us to think about how we can actually use this tool to work through some of the problems that have been raised by the COVID crisis. And so on that note, there's some things I want us to keep in the back of our mind as we're talking today. So first off, we have this question of, has the quality of education decreased this year? This is something a lot of people are wondering, a lot of people are asking. Interestingly, oh, whoops, having a having a PowerPoint problem there. Interestingly, we did some research on this. We did some research on the quality of instruction, responses to objective selection form, learning objectives. We compared spring 2020 to spring 2019 just to see what we got. And we found that contrary to what some might have expected, institutional participation was up over the previous year. Many of us really worried about our response rates dipping, students not being invested. We didn't really see that in the research that we did into all of our IDEA data that was gathered in the past year. Um, in addition, we found no meaningful differences in the quality of teaching, the quality of the course, and student reported progress on course relevant learning objectives. This resource is something that I can share with you folks through email after today's training if you're interested in learning more about it. Um, and so it's really interesting, right? Many of us kind of expected that we would find that students said that their learning was not as good, that they didn't achieve their learning objectives, that they didn't feel the quality of instruction was as good. But our research is showing that there really was not a marked difference. Um, Now, that said, we're still contending with a lot of anxiety about this. And what the data shows us and what our research shows us can't necessarily erase the feelings that we might individually be having that I don't know if my classroom is as effective as I want it to be, or I don't know if I am connecting the way I want to with my students. Um, and so that's something that we, despite what the research says, we want to take seriously. We want to think about that anxiety. And we also want to think about what am I learning today? What am I learning through this COVID crisis that might actually be applicable and useful to me once things are quote unquote back to normal, whatever that is actually going to be, rather than thinking of the lessons that we're learning throughout this year as being only relevant to the COVID crisis. How can we actually say, I'm learning things that are going to improve my teaching, improve my students' learning long after the masks come off and we're all back in the classroom and things are back to what we consider normal teaching environment. So that said, I'd like to encourage you through this training, which we are going to be doing a little bit of what I call the point and click, navigating through the site. Here's where you go to see this, that and the other thing. I would really encourage you to log into your own course evaluation site throughout this training, just so that you can follow along. Your URL is right up there on the screen. You use your regular Utah State credentials. It's just HTTP blah 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 usu.campuslabs.com/faculty. That's the login information. Caveat here, while our company is now called Anthology, we are still using the old URL that we were using before. So go ahead and log into that real quick. And once you've logged in, you should see something that looks relatively like this. Uh, this is the home page for the instructor. Just so you know, the page that I'm using today that I'm showing you is a sort of fake data account that we create for training purposes. So some of the data that you'll see will look a little funny, and you'll say, "Oh, that I've never heard of a faculty member who taught 10 course sections in one term." Or maybe you have. um, but just know that that's because this is a made up account that we use for training purposes. Um, so now that you're logged in, there's a few things that I want to point out to you about your main hub page. First off, just as a reminder, everything in this page is based on the term that you select. So if you log in and you're looking for reports and you can't see them, I would say make sure that you're actually logged into the correct term. Uh, because otherwise, you're not going to see what you're looking for. You can use this drop down menu to find the term that you're interested in. And then once you've selected the correct term, you're going to see all of the course sections that are being evaluated in that given term. First off, people use this site for is, they want to see results. Every individual course section, once it has closed and once reports are available, you'll see this little view results button. And then this is going to take you to a page that many of you are already familiar with. These are your idea reports. Like I said, we're not going to delve in today to what this data necessarily means or to reading these reports. We can make that information available to you in another way. But remember that you've got a number of reports available to you on this screen. Your summative reports are where you're going to see your progress on relevant objectives score, your summary score, your ratings of summative questions, average of excellent teacher and average of excellent course. It's also where you're going to find your formative tab, which is where you delve into the teaching methods that you've been using and their success with your students. The quantitative tab is just going to give you the straight up numbers for every question that was asked of your students. What's the mean score? The qualitative tab is where you're going to see your comments, your feedback, your written feedback from students. And then the segment comparison is where you're going to be able to compare your scores to other people within your unit, within your school, within other people who taught the same course that you did. These are the kinds of reports that are available to you on this page. Remember that you also have other features here, the ability to view adjusted versus raw averages. You're able to compare yourself to not only the IDEA database, but to your own institution, to your own discipline. Converted average comparisons show up at the bottom here, and that's pretty much what I want to stick to, is just making sure you have a basic overview of those features on the reports page. As we return to our home page, I also want to point out your ability to check on your roster. This is something we really encourage because for whatever reason, something might happen. There's a student who they were enrolled in your class, but then they dropped, or there's a student who's coming to class who's enrolled in your class, but for some reason they're not showing up in course evaluations. The roster is going to show you who is getting a course evaluation for your class. So when you select the roster, you're able to go in, you're able to search for individual students. I just encourage people to, take a look at this throughout the term, make sure it's accurate. If you see any disparities, let your site administrator know so that that can be rectified and you make sure that the right people are filling out course evaluations for your class. Returning to that home page, I also want to point out that when a course evaluation is completed for a given course section, this is what you're going to see. You're going to see, in addition to that results tab, what your overall response rate was for that course section, how many students were enrolled in that course section. But then let's say you've got a course section that's not completed, and I apologize for the slight fuzziness of this slide. I with the data I was working with, I wasn't able to get a cleaner image. But what I want to point out here is that whereas that top example shows a course section where the evaluations are complete and you can view results, if the administration where your students are filling out their surveys, if it's open, you're going to see this button that says View Evaluation Link. The direct evaluation link is a link that you can share with your students that will take them just to your course section. So this is something we really urge campuses or faculty to use for a number of reasons. But this is really getting into, the question I want us to start answering, which is, how do these features help you to stay connected with your students? If you have an evaluation upcoming, students are meant to be filling out their surveys. What's the benefit to you of using that direct access link? Well, one of the things we want to encourage you to do is, if applicable, put aside time during whether it's in-person lecture or virtual lecture to hold these in-person course evaluations. Um, and you know, this is really an opportunity for you to start talking to your students about the value of course evaluations. Holding evaluations during class time signals their importance to your students. Make sure you have a captive audience. This is something that definitely raises response rates, is when we actually set time aside during class to have course evaluations. So that's something that you can use that direct access link for. Put it on the whiteboard, share it through your course information system, email it to students, have them fill out their course evaluations in class. But the bigger question that we really need to answer is, how do we get our students actually invested in the course evaluations process, and why is it valuable for us to do that? Well, we've found that when students are actually invested, when students actually know why they should fill out their course evaluations, why it matters, not only are they more likely to fill out course evaluations, but they're more likely to fill out in a substantive way. So if we think about the rate my professor model of course evaluations that has kind of taken our world by storm, Rate My Professor is really like a Yelp review model, right? This is where students can go and say to other users, this is a good teacher, or this is a bad teacher. And there's a lot of problems with that, right? There's a lot of problems with the Rate My Professor model. Course evaluations should not be like Rate My Professor. Course evaluations should be about improving teaching and learning and engaging students in that goal. So how do you do that? Talk to students about why course evaluations matter, how they impact your day-to-day teaching. Talk to students about how you will use course evaluations. How have you used them in the past? Model to students that there actually is an impact to what they have to say. When students realize that it actually matters to you what their feedback is, they're more likely to give substantive feedback, and they're more likely to take it seriously. And just as a aside here, this is going to inform everything we talk about today. The value of talking to students about course evaluations, of being transparent with students about course evaluations, cannot be overstated. Now, throughout the rest of today's talk, I'm going to give various suggestions to you. I'm going to say, try this or try that or do this, that, and the other thing. I want to be really clear that there's no expectation that you will do every possible thing that you could do. That's just not practical, right? We're busy. We are there to teach a specific subject matter, not to teach the value of course evaluations. That's not on our syllabus. But what I would hope is that as I give you these ideas, as I through some different examples, my hope is that you'll hear one thing that resonates and that you'll consider trying as an effort to stay connected with your students and show your students the value of thinking about how to assess their own learning and what they can gain from learning to think about their learning environment and what they're achieving in their learning environment. So returning to our homepage, the next thing that I want us to focus on today is course evaluation questions. I'm curious if you know how to raise your hand on Microsoft Teams. I'd be curious to know whether anybody uses the instructor added custom questions. If you do and feel like just quickly raising your hand on Microsoft Teams, I'd be really interested to see whether this is something anybody is using. Okay, awesome. This is great. So I'm seeing a number of people raising their hands. That's really great. A number of you aren't using this feature. Some of you might not even know that this feature exists. That's totally normal. But this is something I really want you to consider whether or not it has a place in your classroom. So from your home screen, top menu, there's the course evaluations questions. When you log in here, what you're going to see is a list of all the course sections that you taught in that given term. If the evaluation for that course has closed, you're going to see the ability to view the evaluation. If the evaluation for that course is not yet closed, you'll see a button which says not only view but edit evaluation. And when you click on that button, you're going to see a couple of useful things. First off, on the left, you're going to see all of the questions that your student was asked in their survey. This can be really useful if you're ever wondering, what are my students actually being asked in the course evaluation? You can view the evaluation and see right there on the left what questions they're being asked. But on the right, you're also going to see this custom questions area, and particularly this edit tab where you have the ability to add specific custom questions. When you log into this feature, it's a really simple interface. I'm not going to lie to you and say it's super sophisticated and fun to use, but the one benefit of it is that it is simple. You have two options. You can create a multiple choice question with a single select, or you can create a text box entry for comments. Whenever you do this, bear in mind that this question is these questions that you add are only going to be added to the course section for whom you selected add questions. So the questions aren't going to carry over to a future instance of that section that you're teaching. They're not going to carry over to other sections that you're teaching in the class. You do have to add these questions to every section that you want them added to. So that's one thing I want to make sure we're aware of. The second thing I want to say about adding custom questions is that whenever we add custom questions, there's two things that we really need to think about. First off, what data are we hoping to gather from these questions? And second, what are we planning to do with that data? And that second one is really the kicker, because I talk to a lot of faculty who they get excited about this feature and they add, 10, 15 custom questions to the survey because they just want to ask their students all kinds of things. And that's great. We want to ask our students things. But when you consider that this is part of what already might be a 40 question long evaluation, if we add 10 questions, we're gonna get into the area where our students don't want to answer them because the survey is too long. We really encourage that if you're going to add custom questions, you don't add more than 3. And that you really think about why you want to gather this specific data and what you're going to use that data to accomplish. Data is great. I work for a data company. We live in a world where data is very important, but remember that data is just so many numbers and symbols in the ether unless we're actually going to use it. Data is only as useful to us as what we do with it to achieve our goals. So really think before adding custom questions. What goals are you hoping to achieve with the data that you gather? Chris H., I see that your hand is still raised. I just want to make sure that you don't have a question or
presentation.
Okay. No, that's totally fine. I just wanted to check. Okay, so you have this really awesome feature, this ability to add custom questions to your surveys. How does this help you achieve that bigger goal that we're talking about today of building a culture of assessment, staying connected with your students? Now, I'm going to give you again some suggestions here, and I just want to reiterate that the expectation here is not that you will do all of these things. I don't want anybody to get overwhelmed by, a wealth of options that I'm giving you here and think, gosh, if I'm not doing this, then I'm doing something wrong. My hope is just that you'll see something that resonates for you. So, a couple of things to consider. First, if you're going to add custom questions to your course evaluations, consider whether or not you could ask those questions throughout the term. So what do I mean by that? Rather than just having final summative questions in your course evaluations, is there a benefit to asking your students these questions periodically throughout the term? So what do I mean by the kinds of questions that you could ask? Well, you could ask questions that focus on the remote communication options that are available to students, like how are virtual office hours going? Are discussion board events useful to you? How is the technology working for you? Are there things about the virtual lecture experience that are helpful or that you feel could be improved? You can deliver these questions not just as your final course evaluation, but throughout the term through a discussion activity or maybe a quiz that you do 2 to 3 times a year, or I'm sorry, a term, to gather this information as you go. One of the things that is really valuable for staying connected with your students and building that culture of assessment within your classroom where students see that it matters to think about their learning is to share these questions but then discuss the responses in class. One of the big focuses of the IDEA instruments is to ask students to reflect on the learning that they achieved and the teaching methods that they observed. The idea here is that it is of value to a student's learning to think about their learning process in an analytical way. So rather than just trusting your final course evaluations to do that work, ask students to do that work throughout the term. Ask them to reflect on their learning, what's working for them, what could be improved, and discuss the responses with them in class to signal your engagement in the conversation. Then you can include these questions in final course evaluations in order to bring the discussion full circle. And you can look at that data in the context of the rest of what you learned that term, other responses that you got to those questions throughout the term. So think about those final summative course evaluation questions that you can add to your evaluation as not being something that necessarily only happens at the end of the term, but a conversation that you can build into the term in order to stay connected with your students and connected with their learning. Returning to our homepage, let's talk about the objective selection form. Um, and I, for one, I'm a pretty big fan of the objective selection process with IDEA. When I was a faculty member, the universities that I worked for did not use the IDEA instruments. And so when I joined Anthology and became familiar with this pedagogy, I was actually really impacted by the value of a system that asks faculty, that asks me to think about what my learning objectives are for the term and what I'm hoping my students will achieve. This is something we are doing naturally in course planning, right? It's just part of the course planning process, but the actual intentional work of going through and selecting objectives has a unique value. So for those of you who just want a refresher on how the objective selection form works, there's a couple of things to bear in mind. So first off, we generally advise that you select 3 to 5 objectives as either important or essential out of all of the objectives that are available to you. The reason for this is twofold. One, you're going to get more substantive results the more focused your selection of learning objectives is. So that's one benefit. A secondary benefit is that it really, the process of selecting your objectives helps you to hone in on what your class is really trying to achieve, and that has its own value. Um, when you look at this page, what you're going to see is that how many learning objectives you've selected as either important or essential. In this case, we can see that 0 have been selected. But once you start going through each of these learning objectives and making selections, that number is going to change. Remember to always click the Save button once you've made your selections of learning objectives. The objective selection form is really simple. You know, it's not rocket science. Really, where it becomes complicated is when you really have to do the work of narrowing down, you know, what it is your main learning objectives are, narrowing it down to those 3 to 5. That can both be the difficult piece and it can also be the rewarding piece. But I also want to make sure that you folks are aware of an additional feature, which is the objective selection form manager. Eventually, objective selection form, which is a button that just appears next to each individual section that you're teaching, eventually in our plans for the product, that button is going to go away. And instead, you're going to make all of your objective selections in the objective selection form manager, which appears at the top of your screen. I don't know if any of you folks have used this yet, but I would encourage you to familiarize yourself with it. This is what the objective selection form manager is. As you can see, you have the ability to drop down both present and past terms where you've taught course sections. As opposed to the objective selection form where every objective is written out and you select important and essential and or minor. Here everything is abbreviated, but you still have access to all the information. So for example, if you can't remember what objectives 3 is, you click on that 3 right there, it's going to pop up with the objective so that you can read it right there. Um, in addition to this sort of streamlined process, one of the values of the objective selection form manager is it allows you to compare your objectives to past terms. So how do you do that? Well, let's say that in fall 2020, you're going to be teaching Accounting 249, and you know that you taught Accounting 249 in a past term, and you're curious to see what objectives you selected back then and think about whether or not you want to shift any of them. Well, start off by choosing a section to use as a comparison. Again, you always pick the term that you want to look at. So if you know I taught this back in fall 2018, I want to see what I did in fall 2018. Once you've selected your term, select the section that you want to focus on. In this case, I'm going to look at Accounting 249, Section 1. When I make that selection, it's going to appear in green at the top of the page. And what I can see here is that in 2018, I selected Objective 1 as important. Right now, I've got Objective 1 set as minor. So if we look at Accounting 249 under Fall 2020, right now I've only got Objectives 6 and 7 set as essential learning objectives. Maybe I want to look at the objectives that I set in Fall 2018 and make changes accordingly. It's just useful both to remember what you did in the past without having to move all over your site, but it can also help you to really think about whether or not your objectives have changed between fall 2020 and fall 2018. I don't know about you, but when I would teach a class multiple times, I would realize over time that there were certain things I wanted to accomplish in that class that were changing or shifting, or that maybe my department's goals had shifted over time. And so I wanted to rethink what my objectives were. So I really encourage you to get familiar with the objective selection form manager, spend some time with it, use it when filling out your objective selections. It's a really useful feature. But how does this feature help you stay connected with your students? We select our learning objectives because it impacts our reports at the end of the term, right? We have to select them in order to get accurate reports. But as I intimated earlier, we also select them as a way of honing in on what our actual teaching goals are for the term. So if we're doing that intellectual work, why don't we leverage that intellectual work to stay more connected with our students? So there's some things I'd like to advise you to think about possibly using the objective selection process for with your students to help stay connected with your students. One, consider walking students through the objective selection process. Show them how intentional you are about their learning. Show them that this is a process that you go through, that it's not all happening some mysterious man behind the curtain, that you are really thinking about what this process is like. Show them that the purpose of course evaluations for them is not to just get a rating on whether or not they liked the class, but to really try to figure out, are they achieving these objectives that we want them to achieve? And how do we make sure that they're learning what we want them to learn? So consider actually engaging your students in the objective selection form process. Be transparent with your students about the relationship between the activities you're doing in class and your selective learning objectives, whether that's a lecture or a group activity or a assignment. Preface these activities with a reassertion of what objectives are in play. Hey, today's lecture, we're going to focus on these objectives, you know, and then we list the objectives so that we're actually transparent with students about what we're hoping that they will achieve and learn in the class. And then check in with your students on whether they are actually achieving those objectives. Show them that you care about what you've told them are the learning objectives in the class. Some of us already do this, right? Some of us are already very transparent with our students in every learning activity about here's what I want you to having learned. What I am suggesting here is that you can actually use the course evaluation tool, use its features to guide some of that transparency and some of that work with your students. Finally, and this is something that some of us will be more drawn to than others, is you can talk to your students about how objectives actually map onto job skills. Uh, Oftentimes students, they read our syllabi, they see a list of objectives on the syllabi, they breeze right through it, right? They don't really think about why that necessarily matters. And part of that is because we aren't often talking to our students about why it matters. Uh, I would like to propose that there's actually room to tell our students, here's what these learning objectives have to do with the career that you have chosen or are hoping to go into. There's opportunity here to discuss how we can translate these objectives into narratives in job interviews or on our resumes or in professional activities. If like me, you ever taught writing or communication, you know, writing and communication are important objectives on the objective selection form. How do we talk to our students about why them achieving those objectives is a useful skill in the job market? How do we talk to them about how they can articulate those skills in their resume job interviews? Again, this is just another way that we can signal to our students our intentionality about their learning, want them to be intentional about how they're assessing their own learning and to see that these processes that we go through are actually designed to help them improve moving forward and succeed in their goals moving forward. So we're starting to move towards the end of today's training, and I want to talk about a few takeaways real quick. So first off, the important takeaway is to talk to your students about the purpose of assessment. Why do we want them to think about the course evaluation process? Why is it valuable to them to really think about what they're learning, how they're learning? Talk to students about what learning objectives actually mean for them in terms of their future job performance, in terms of future classes that they might be teaching. Also think about how you can gather formative data from students, whether it's through quizzes or discussion boards, about what they're learning that you can then view in context with your summative course evaluations data. Something else to bear in mind that I hope we'll take away is that according to our research, teaching has not gotten worse because of COVID-19, and learning has not decreased because of COVID-19. That said, the strategies that we're talking about today, which we're thinking about particularly in the context of a changed learning environment, they're not just going to be useful today. They'll be useful in 3 years. They'll be useful in 5 years. These are strategies that we can implement throughout our teaching careers to really improve teaching and learning and get and build a connection with our students and help them see the intentionality of our teaching. I also want to give a little plug that the next session in today's campus visit is actually going to focus on the formative feedback tool. Um, which is particularly a tool that's available to all of you that's designed to help you stay connected with your students throughout the term. So I really hope that you'll attend that session. But what I'd like to do now, I've really focused today on how we can use this tool to stay connected with our students, how we can think about assessment and the evaluation process as a way to foster that connection. Because we've got about 15 minutes left, I wanted to open things up for two reasons. One, I want to see what questions you have for me. And secondly, I want to see whether or not there are things that you have been doing to stay connected with your students during these times that have been particularly successful. And really just that you might want to share with your colleagues, because I know that one of the additional consequences of COVID-19 is that we're not seeing each other as much as we used to. A lot of us feel much more professionally isolated than we did before this happened. And so there's a benefit to us coming together and thinking and sharing our experiences and our thoughts. So if you have either a question for me, or a comment on what we've discussed, or thoughts on something unrelated to what we've discussed but related to staying connected with your students, I'd ask that you raise your hand through the Microsoft Teams function, and then when I call on you, that you can unmute yourself and share your thoughts. Just going to give everybody a moment to think, and please don't be shy. Mackenzie.
Sorry, just trying to unmute there. I was just wondering if anyone's had a lot of success with like offering extra credit for students' evaluations and how that's worked out for them, if there was a difference or not.
I would be really interested to hear anybody's thoughts on that. Is there anybody who gives extra credit for course evaluations, or who offers other incentives, let's say, for completing their course evaluations?
So I do. I'm a lecturer in chem and biochem. I don't, I can't compare because I've never not offered it, but I offer what are basically peanuts and extra credit. And I don't know if it helps or hurts, but I can tell you my responses are between 70 and 80%, and these are courses with more than 150 students.
That's
So
pretty good.
doesn't,
That's pretty good.
no, I think it hurts. I can't tell you how much it helps though, but it's really, and at least there was an automated system to automatically add the extra credit points. I don't recall if that's still running, but you don't necessarily have to do it manually if you don't want to. At least that was true for the past couple years.
Right.
Yeah, I've done the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
I don't offer extra credit. The general response rate without me pestering the students and reminding them to take the surveys is usually 50% or less. But if you offer the extra credit, I usually offer like 2 points towards their final grade, which is 400 points. So again, peanuts, just like was said before, but it ups the percentage of students who take it to the 80% range. So even a few points is very encouraging.
It's interesting, Mackenzie, because there's a lot of people who have really strong feelings on this, right? There's a lot of people who feel really strongly that we should not offer extra credit for course evaluations. There are a lot of people who feel like, no, this is an important part of their learning, and if we want to incentivize them taking part in this learning experience, then yeah, we should offer that. There's lots of ways to incentivize in addition to extra credit. I've known campuses who've offered. I've known faculty who've offered prizes to the class that gets the highest response rate. I've known faculty who they offer some other kind of prize or entry into a drawing, for if they complete their course evaluations, they get entered in this drawing, and they get a $5 Starbucks gift card or something like that. Those kinds of incentives are more accessible to some of us than others, obviously. But I think that something to bear in mind is when we talk about response rates, the number one thing that raises response rates is holding evaluations during class time, and then actually talking to your students about why evaluations matter. Um, that might be a little surprising, but we have found in our research that actually building this culture of assessment into the classroom, where we build a value for course evaluations into the classroom, that is just as effective at raising course evaluations as delivering incentives. Chad, I see
Yeah,
your hand raised.
I had this is more a question for the group. So my understanding is, I believe we've been doing idea evaluation since I've been at Utah State, but before then, the approach was you'd have someone come into the classroom, the instructor would leave, and everyone would fill out the evaluations, and we'd probably not get 100% response rate, but we'd get a very high response rate. And you mentioned today that would be a good practice to basically do it during class time. I'm just wondering if anyone else at Utah State does that, where they have someone else come in, or if you as the instructor just say, okay, everyone open your laptops and do the evaluations now. I'm curious if that's happening on campus, or, Bethany, if you see that at other schools.
I have a comment about that.
Go for it.
So I teach composition and writing. So my classes are capped at about 23 students, but I've done both. I've offered the extra credit, and I've just had them do it during class. And I've had more success just having them do it during class. And what I normally do is I'll teach for the 70 minutes or whatever, and then when we have about 10 minutes left, I'll just say, all right, open up your laptops. Please take your course evaluation survey, and as soon as you're done, you're free to leave. And then I just leave and go up to my office. On the times I've done that, all the students that have been present in class have sat there and taken the evaluation before they've left class. So I haven't had another person come in, but I have physically left the room, so it's not awkward that I'm staring at them while they're evaluating me as their instructor.
Right. Yeah.
Bethany, can I jump back in on that? That's really helpful to hear. Bethany, I guess my expectation is that those who do fill these out without some type of incentive or what we just heard about, just doing it in class, those who are most likely to fill this out would be those who are either really happy with the class or really upset with the class. Is there any evidence to back up that assertion that you see from IDEA's perspective?
That's really interesting, Chad, because that's something that a lot of people think, but we actually don't have none of our research has indicated that that's true. Our research has found that students are more likely to fill out the evaluation if they're actually given time in class to do it, and if it's impressed upon them why it matters, and if their faculty talk to them about it. Yes, I'm sure we could find outlier situations where you've got students who they really hated the class and they just can't wait to fill out their course evaluation and tell you how much they hated the class, or conversely, we've got students who were just in love with your class, and so they are really eager to do that. But the research really doesn't show that those outliers are the ones who are most likely to fill out course evaluations. And in fact, what's interesting about that, something I always encourage faculty to think about, is there is a real temptation when looking at our course evaluations to focus on those outliers. I know that from personal experience. If I have a really negative comment, that's the one that sticks with me. If I have a really positive comment, that's the one that makes my heart sing. But in reality, what we encourage our faculty to do is focus on trends in course evaluation scores rather than those outliers. And the trends are just as easy to find as those outliers when we look at the research into who's more likely to fill out course evaluations. And just to speak to your earlier question, Chad, yes, I have tons of campuses who they use the direct evaluation link to still hold their evaluations in campus. I've got faculty who do it, and then I've got campuses who it's like the law of the land. That's what everybody does. So it is very common and it is very successful.
Thank you so much for that. And one follow-up on the direct link as well. I assume that that's limited, that only students who are actually enrolled in the class could utilize that link. But if
Correct.
you're just sharing it, does it have them log in somehow when they go with
So
their number?
So basically, if they would log in through their same credentials, if they're already logged into the system, then it would just take them immediately, and it would just take them to the evaluation for your class. Someone who wasn't enrolled in your class, they wouldn't get anything. It would just basically be a blank page.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Terry Wesserman. I'm sorry if I butchered your last name. See your
There.
hand raised. There you go.
Yep, sorry, delay with the mic. It's Weisman, but I had a question about, and if you covered this, I apologize, the dates of when the survey is offered, because I always have students that are busy doing final projects, and I myself, as a non-traditional student in the past, also experienced this where I kept thinking, I'll get to it, I'll get to it, I'll get, and then all of a sudden it's gone before the last week of the semester. And I had a good experience where when I taught face-to-face, where I would write it on the board when students walked in. They would often, as they're sitting there, I would see them get on their computers and just take it. And I was thinking I could transfer that to my online courses this semester with my overview page. And so I'm wondering which modules I should actually, for which weeks, instead of having my daily slide that I had in my face-to-face course, when they log on to the module page for that week, which are the best weeks to put it on?
So, I mean, that would really depend on when your actual evaluations are running, right? And that's something that I don't have that information off the top of my head of what weeks your evaluations run. But I would say it's certainly something this is again a reason why you should talk to your students about evaluations and assessment throughout the term. Prime them for that conversation, so that when you put it in the module and say, hey, next week is when course evaluations open. Hey, this week course evaluations open. Course evaluations are closing this week, that they're already familiar with that and prepared for that. But this is, again, Terry, another great example of why finding a way to hold evaluations in class is really valuable, because of just the scenario you're talking about where students are busy, we're busy, things are going on, all of a sudden we forget. If we actually give them time to do it in class, in many ways it's a signal of respect to them, that we recognize how busy they are and we want to give them the time to do it in class so they don't have to do it some other time. We've got about 3 minutes left. Does anybody have any last questions or thoughts today? Okay. So I really thank you for your participation today. I hope you found it helpful. I want to give another plug for today's. In half an hour, we're having another session on the formative feedback tool, which is a tool that's available to you folks that I really encourage you to use and get familiar with. It's particularly valuable for helping to build this culture of assessment that we've been talking about in today's discussion. Really just, thank you for your time. I hope you found it useful. I hope to see you in half an hour. Good luck with the term. Stay safe, stay well, and know that we at Anthology are here to help you with your course evaluations needs. All right, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.